In the ancient halls of Haverford Castle, a priceless 15th century sword vanishes, its emerald hilt a beacon for greed. Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of secrets among a nervous curator, a charming guide, a flamboyant knight, and a shadowy visitor. As clues, dust, paint, wax, whisper the truth, she exposes a plot of betrayal and ambition, racing to save a legacy before it's lost to a black market forever. Will the sword's gleam return, or will the castle's pride be its ruin? Chapter 1. The Castle's Pride. The late summer sun cast long shadows across the verdant hills of St. Mary's Hollow, a quaint village in the heart of England, where time seemed to linger like mist in the hollows. At the village's edge stood Haverford Castle, its weathered stone towers rising defiantly against the march of centuries. Within its ancient walls lay a treasure trove of relics, none more revered than the Haverford sword, a 15th century blade forged for Sir Rowland de Haverford, its emerald-encrusted hilt a silent testament to battles long past. The sword, displayed in a glass case in the great hall, drew scholars, tourists, and dreamers alike, each captivated by its whispered tales of valor. Miss Jane Marple, a slight figure with snow-white hair and eyes that missed nothing, had arrived at the castle at the invitation of her old school friend, Lady Beatrice Conway. The two women sat in the castle's drawing room, a cozy space adorned with faded tapestries and heavy oak furniture. A silver tea service gleamed on the table, and the faint scent of lavender drifted from a vase by the window. Lady Conway, a wiry woman with a quick smile and an air of aristocratic fatigue, poured tea with practiced grace. "It's the upkeep, Jane," Lady Conway said, her voice tinged with exasperation. "This castle is a blessing and a curse. The tourists pay for the repairs, but oh, the chaos they bring, and the staff, stretched to their wits' end, every one of them." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her delicate hands cradling the cup. "It sounds trying, Beatrice, but the castle's treasures must be a comfort. The Haverford sword, for instance, I hear it's quite magnificent." Lady Conway's eyes brightened, then clouded. "Oh, it is. A masterpiece, Jane, but I worry about it constantly. It's irreplaceable, you know. And lately, I've noticed odd things. The curator, Mr. Grayson, he's always hovering over it, muttering about its provenance. And that knight reenactor, Sir Cedric, clanking about in his armor. He gives me the shivers." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, though her expression remained serene. "Odd things, you say? People can be so curious about valuable objects, can't they? And not always for the right reasons." Lady Conway leaned forward, lowering her voice. "There's a visitor, too, a Mr. Trent. He's been here several times this month, always lingering by the sword's case. I don't know what to make of him." Miss Marple set her cup down, her mind already turning over the names and motives. "And your staff, Beatrice, the curator, the reenactor, the guides, are they all trustworthy?" Lady Conway hesitated. "I'd like to think so. Clara, the tour guide, is a darling girl, always charming the visitors. But Grayson, he's so possessive of the artifacts. And Sir Cedric, well, he's a showman, isn't he? Lives for the applause. I sometimes wonder if he loves the idea of the sword more than the sword itself." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles appearing almost by magic in her hands. They clicked softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to her thoughts. "People are rarely as simple as they seem, Beatrice. A village like St. Mary's Hollow, or a castle like this, it's all the same. Everyone has their little secrets, their little desires." Lady Conway laughed, though it was a nervous sound. "You haven't changed a bit, Jane, always seeing through people as if they're made of glass." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes drifting to the window, where the castle's towers cast their long shadows across the lawn. She had come for a quiet visit, but already she sensed a puzzle forming, as surely as the clouds gathering on the horizon. The Haverford sword, she thought, was more than a relic. It was a magnet for ambition, envy, or perhaps something darker. And Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and razor-sharp mind, was ready to unravel whatever secrets it held. Chapter 2. The Disappearance. The morning sun had barely crested the turrets of Haverford Castle when a cry shattered the stillness of St. Mary's Hollow. It was a sound of such raw dismay that it seemed to echo through the ancient stones, rousing even the sparrows nestled in the ivy. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the breakfast table with Lady Beatrice Conway, paused mid-sip of her tea, her keen eyes narrowing. The sound had come from the direction of the great hall, and it carried the unmistakable timbre of catastrophe. Lady Conway, her face paling beneath her carefully applied rouge, set down her toast. "Good heavens, Jane, what was that?" Miss Marple folded her napkin with deliberate calm. "Trouble, I expect, Beatrice. Shall we investigate?" The two women hurried through the castle's labyrinthine corridors, their footsteps muffled by the worn Persian rugs. The great hall, a cavernous chamber with vaulted ceilings and tapestries depicting long-forgotten battles, was already a scene of chaos. A small crowd had gathered, staff, a few early visitors, and the castle's caretaker, Mr. Dobbs, whose florid face was contorted in distress. At the center of the commotion stood the display case that housed the Haverford sword, or rather, had housed it. The case was empty, its glass pristine, the velvet cushion within bare of its priceless burden. Miss Marple's gaze swept the scene, noting every detail: the unblemished glass, the undisturbed lock, the faint hum of the deactivated alarm system. "No signs of violence," she murmured, almost to herself. "Curious." Lady Conway clutched her arm. "Jane, it's gone. The sword, our pride, our history, stolen." Before Miss Marple could respond, a heavy tread announced the arrival of Inspector Harrow, a broad-shouldered man with a bristling mustache and a demeanor that suggested he preferred facts to fancies. His eyes, sharp but impatient, scanned the room. "Right then," he barked. "Nobody leaves. This is a crime scene. Dobbs, what happened here?" Mr. Dobbs, wringing his hands, stammered, I came in at 7, as always, to check the hall before opening. The case was empty, sir. I swear it was there last night when I locked up." Inspector Harrow's gaze settled on the case. "No broken glass, no forced entry. The alarm's off, but no one reported it tripping. This is an inside job, mark my words." He turned to the assembled group, his voice rising. "Who was here last night? Speak up." Miss Marple, standing quietly near a tapestry of Sir Rowland de Haverford slaying a foe, observed the faces around her. There was Mr. Harold Grayson, the curator, his thin frame rigid with tension, his fingers twitching as though longing for a pen to steady them. Miss Clara Wells, the tour guide, stood with wide eyes, her usual cheer replaced by a nervous fidgeting with her scarf. Sir Cedric Blake, the night reenactor, loomed in the background, his replica armor clanking faintly as he shifted, his expression a mix of indignation and unease. And then there was Mr. Lionel Trent, the frequent visitor, who lingered at the edge of the crowd, his hands buried in his coat pockets, his face a mask of quiet observation. "Lady Conway," her voice trembling, addressed the inspector. "Harold was here late, cataloging artifacts. Clara locked the hall after the last tour. Sir Cedric was, well, he's always about, practicing his swordplay. And Mr. Trent was here yesterday, wasn't he? I saw him near the case." Inspector Harrow's eyes narrowed. "Right. You lot, stay put. We'll have questions for all of you." He turned to Miss Marple, his tone softening slightly. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Lady Conway says you've a knack for puzzles. Care to share any thoughts?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "It's a trifle early for conclusions, Inspector, but I do find it interesting that the case shows no signs of tampering. Whoever took the sword had knowledge, perhaps of the alarms, perhaps of the lock, and they were careful, very careful." Harrow grunted, clearly unimpressed by her vagueness, and began barking orders to his constable to secure the hall. Miss Marple, however, drifted toward the display case, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. She bent slightly, her sharp eyes scanning the glass. Not a smudge, not a scratch. The lock, a modern addition to the antique case, was intact, its keyhole gleaming as if recently polished. She glanced at the floor, noting the faint layer of dust that always seemed to settle in old castles, despite the best efforts of the staff. There were no clear footprints, but a subtle disturbance caught her eye. A faint trail, as if something had been dragged ever so slightly across the stone. "Inspector," she called softly, "have you noticed these marks? They're not footprints, but they suggest movement, something heavy, perhaps." Harrow crouched beside her, his brow furrowing. "Could be the case itself was shifted, but why? The sword's not heavy enough to need dragging." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "Not the sword alone, no, but perhaps it was removed with something else, part of the case or a container to conceal it." Harrow's mustache twitched. "You're suggesting they took the sword and what? Hid it in a box?" "I'm suggesting nothing, Inspector, merely observing." Her tone was mild, but her mind was racing. The absence of damage, the silent alarm, the drag marks, all pointed to someone who knew the castle's workings intimately, someone with access and with time. As Harrow began questioning the staff, Miss Marple retreated to a corner, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. She listened as Mr. Grayson was called forward. His voice, usually precise, quavered as he spoke. "I was here until 10 last night, cataloging the armory records. The sword was in its case when I left. I set the alarms myself, checked them twice, as always." Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted toward the empty case. "You're very thorough, Mr. Grayson," she said gently. "Did you see anyone else in the hall last night? Perhaps someone lingering?" Grayson's tick, a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth, intensified. "No, no one. I was alone. The castle was quiet." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. Grayson's nervousness was not unexpected. He was a man devoted to order, and this theft was a personal affront. But was it guilt or merely anxiety? She filed the question away, her needles never pausing. Next came Clara Wells, her youthful energy subdued by the morning's shock. "I gave the last tour at 5, she said, twisting her scarf. "The sword was there, I'm sure of it. I locked the hall afterward, and Mr. Grayson was still in his office when I left." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You're very observant, Miss Wells. Did you notice Mr. Trent during your tour? He seems fond of the sword." Clara's cheeks flushed. "He was there, yes. He asked questions about the sword's history, its value. He's been coming a lot lately. But he left before closing, I think. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. You think? You're not certain? Clara hesitated. Well, I didn't see him leave, but he wasn't in the hall when I locked up. Miss Marple smiled, but her mind noted the gap. Trent's presence or absence was a thread to tug later. Sir Cedric Blake was next, his entrance as theatrical as ever. His replica armor gleamed, though it was clear he'd donned it hastily, one buckle misaligned. "This is outrageous," he boomed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "The Haverford sword is a sacred relic. I'd sooner cut off my own hand than steal it." Inspector Harrow raised an eyebrow. "You were here late, weren't you, practicing your performance?" Cedric's chest puffed out. "I was honing my craft, Inspector. A knight's duty is to embody history, not plunder it." Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost lost in the hall's vastness. "You handle swords often, Sir Cedric. You must know their weight, their balance. Did you ever handle the Haverford sword?" Cedric's eyes widened, then narrowed. "Never. It's forbidden to touch the artifacts. I have my own blade, a fine replica, mind you." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze lingering on his polished armor. His bravado was a shield, she thought, but what lay beneath it? Finally, Lionel Trent was summoned. He approached with the reluctance of a man who preferred shadows to spotlights. His coat was drab, his posture slightly stooped, but his eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, held a flicker of calculation. "I'm just a visitor," he said, his voice low. "I came to see the sword yesterday, like always. I left before the hall closed." Miss Marple's tone was gentle, almost maternal. "You've a great interest in history, Mr. Trent. Have you ever spoken with Sir Cedric? He shares your passion, I understand." Trent's hands twitched in his pockets. "Once or twice. He's enthusiastic, likes to talk about his role." Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment. Trent's reticence was as telling as Cedric's bluster, Grayson's nerves, or Clara's hesitation. Each had a piece of the puzzle, she was certain, but the picture was still forming. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple slipped away to examine the hall more closely. The drag marks intrigued her. They were faint, almost invisible, but they led from the case to a nearby alcove, where a suit of armor stood sentinel. She knelt, ignoring the curious glances of Harrow's constable, and peered at the alcove's floor. A single thread, fine and black, caught her eye, snagged on a rough stone. She tucked it into her handkerchief, her mind turning over possibilities. A thread could mean nothing, or everything. Returning to the case, she studied the lock again. It was a modern pin tumbler, simple but effective, requiring a key that only Grayson and Lady Conway possessed. Yet the alarm system, linked to the case, had not sounded. "Someone knew how to disable it," she murmured, "or someone knew it wasn't set." She glanced at Grayson, who was now speaking with Harrow, his face pale. Clara hovered nearby, her scarf now twisted into knots. Cedric, pacing, muttered about honor and legacy. Trent had retreated to the edge of the crowd, his eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple's mind sifted through their words, their gestures, their silences. The sword was gone, but its absence was a clue in itself. Whoever had taken it had planned meticulously, leaving no trace, except, perhaps, those faint drag marks and a single black thread. Lady Conway approached, her eyes wide with worry. "Jane, what do you make of it? Is it hopeless?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. "Not hopeless, Beatrice, A theft like this is like a tangled skein of wool. You must find the right thread to pull, and the whole thing unravels. As the morning wore on, Inspector Harrow continued his interrogations, his voice growing sharper with each unanswered question. But Miss Marple, standing quietly in the shadow of a tapestry, knew that the answers lay not in loud demands, but in the small, overlooked details, the twitch of a hand, the pause in a sentence, the thread in an alcove. The Haverford sword was hidden, but not lost, and Miss Jane Marple, with her unassuming air and relentless curiosity, was already pulling at the threads of truth. Chapter 3. The Curator's Tale. The morning's chaos in Haverford Castle's great hall had settled into a tense hum, like the quiet before a storm. The empty display case, once home to the Haverford sword, stood as a silent accusation, its pristine glass mocking the gathered crowd. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a cushioned bench near a leaded window, her knitting needles clicking with metronomic precision, observed the scene with her usual unobtrusive clarity. The suspects, Mr. Harold Grayson, Miss Clara Wells, Sir Cedric Blake, and Mr. Lionel Trent, hovered in their respective corners of the hall, each radiating a distinct unease. Inspector Harrow, his mustache bristling with authority, had begun his interrogations, and it was the curator, Harold Grayson, who now faced the brunt of his scrutiny. Grayson stood before the inspector, his wiry frame rigid, his hands clasped tightly as if to steady their trembling. His face, usually pale, was now ashen, and a nervous tic flickered at the corner of his mouth, betraying the strain beneath his scholarly composure. He wore a tweed jacket, slightly frayed at the cuffs, and his thinning hair was combed meticulously over his scalp, as if order in appearance could compensate for the disorder around him. Miss Marple noted the way. His eyes darted toward the empty case. Not with guilt, she thought, but with a kind of personal affront, as if the sword's absence were a wound to his very being. "Mr. Grayson," Inspector Harrow began, his voice sharp. "You were here late last night, cataloging, you say. Until 10 o'clock, was it?" "Yes, Inspector," Grayson replied, his voice high and strained. "I was in my office, updating the armory records. It's delicate work, cross-referencing provenances, ensuring every artifact is accounted for. The sword was in its case when I left, I'm certain of it." Harrow's eyes narrowed. "Certain, are you? And you set the alarms yourself?" Grayson nodded vigorously, his tic intensifying. "I did. I always do. The system is simple but reliable. A key to the case, a code for the alarm. I checked it twice before I locked the hall and went home." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment as she leaned forward, her voice soft but clear. "You're very thorough, Mr. Grayson. A man of your precision must notice everything. Was there anyone else about last night? Perhaps someone who lingered after hours?" Grayson's eyes flicked toward her, then away, settling on a point near the inspector's boots. "No, Miss Marple, the castle was quiet. I saw no one." His hesitation was slight, but to Miss Marple it was as loud as a shout. She smiled gently, her expression one of kindly interest, but her mind was cataloging his every gesture. Grayson's devotion to the castle's artifacts was well known. Lady Conway had spoken of his almost obsessive care for the Haverford sword, his hours spent polishing its case, his monographs on its history. Yet this morning, his nervousness seemed to exceed mere shock at the theft. Was it fear of blame or something deeper? Harrow pressed on. "You've got a key to the case, haven't you? Who else does?" "Only Lady Conway. Grayson said quickly. "The key is kept in my office safe when not in use. I checked it this morning. It's still there." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. "And the alarm code, Mr. Grayson? Who knows that?" Grayson's hands tightened. "Myself, Lady Conway, and, well, Clara knows it, as she locks the hall after tours. But she's trustworthy, Inspector. I'd stake my reputation on it." Harrow grunted, scribbling in his notebook. "We'll see about that. You didn't hear anything unusual last night? No noises, no footsteps?" Grayson shook his head, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "It was quiet, as I said. I was focused on my work. The castle's old. Creaks and groans are common." Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice as mild as ever. "You must know the sword's value, Mr. Grayson. A collector might pay a fortune for it, mightn't they?" Grayson's face flushed. "I'd never sell it. The sword is a piece of history, not a commodity. I've dedicated my life to preserving it, not peddling it to some profiteer." His outburst drew eyes from across the hall. Clara Wells, standing near a tapestry, looked up, her scarf now a twisted knot in her hands. Sir Cedric Blake, polishing his replica sword with exaggerated care, snorted softly. Lionel Trent, still at the room's edge, seemed to shrink further into his coat. Miss Marple noted each reaction, her mind weaving connections. Harrow dismissed Grayson with a curt nod, turning to his constable. "Check the safe for that key, and get me the alarm logs." He glanced at Miss Marple, his expression a mix of skepticism and grudging respect. "Anything else you'd like to add, Miss Marple?" She smiled, her needles clicking. "Only that Mr. Grayson's devotion to his work is admirable, but devotion can sometimes blind us to what's happening under our noses, don't you think?" Harrow frowned, unsure whether she was jesting. Miss Marple, however, was already turning her attention to the hall itself. She rose, her movements slow but deliberate, and approached the empty display case once more. The drag marks she had noticed earlier were still there, faint but unmistakable, leading toward the alcove with the suit of armor. She knelt, ignoring the curious glance of Harrow's constable, and examined the floor. The black thread she had found earlier was still tucked in her handkerchief, but now she noticed something else, a tiny chip of metal, no larger than a pinhead, glinting in a crack between the stones. She retrieved it with care, holding it to the light. It was silver, possibly from a tool, and its presence suggested precision work, not haste. Standing, she glanced at the alcove. The suit of armor, a 16th century piece, stood as it always had, its visor closed, its gauntlets empty. But something about its positioning struck her as odd. It was slightly askew, as if someone had bumped it or moved it to conceal something behind. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the base. There, in the shadow of the armor's plinth, was a faint scuff mark, not unlike the drag marks near the case. She made a mental note, her mind turning over the possibilities. Had the thief hidden the sword temporarily behind the armor? Or was the alcove a distraction meant to mislead? As she returned to her bench, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to Grayson's testimony. His insistence on the sword's presence at 10 o'clock was firm, but his hesitation when asked about others in the castle was telling. She recalled Lady Conway's mention of his late hours, his solitary habits. A man so consumed by his work might not notice subtle intrusions, or he might notice too much and choose to say nothing. And then there was the key, safe in his office, and the alarm code, known to Clara. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. The puzzle was complex, but the pieces were beginning to align. Inspector Harrow, meanwhile, was preparing to question Clara Wells. Miss Marple watched as the young guide approached, her cheerful demeanor replaced by a nervous energy. Clara's role in locking the hall made her a key figure, and Miss Marple was eager to hear her account. But for now, her thoughts lingered on Grayson. His tick, his fervor, his fleeting glance at the case. They were threads in the tapestry of the theft, and Miss Marple was determined to follow them to their source. She settled back on the bench, her knitting a quiet counterpoint to the hall's tension. The Haverford sword was gone, but its absence was speaking volumes, and Miss Jane Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, was listening closely. Chapter 4. The Guide's Charm. The great hall of Haverford Castle, with its towering stone walls and ancient tapestries, seemed to hold its breath as Inspector Harrow turned his attention to Clara Wells. The young tour guide stepped forward, her usual brightness dimmed by the weight of the morning's events. Miss Jane Marple, seated on her bench near the leaded window, watched closely, her knitting needles moving with their steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. Clara's scarf, a cheerful blue, now hopelessly twisted, betrayed her nerves, but her eyes held a spark of resilience that Miss Marple found intriguing. Clara Wells was a slight figure, no more than 25, with auburn hair pinned loosely and a face that radiated warmth when she smiled. Her role as the castle's guide had made her a favorite among visitors, her tales of medieval intrigue delivered with a flair that brought the past to life. But now, standing before the inspector, she seemed smaller, her hands fidgeting as she faced his stern gaze. "Miss Wells," Harrow began, his voice clipped. "You locked the great hall last night after the final tour, correct?" Clara nodded, her voice steady despite her evident unease. "Yes, Inspector. The last tour ended at 5. I checked the hall, made sure everything was in order, and locked the doors at 1:30. The sword was in its case. I'm certain of it. It caught the light as I passed, just as it always does." Miss Marple's needles paused briefly, her sharp eyes noting the conviction in Clara's tone. Certainty, she knew, could be a shield or a slip. "You have a keen eye, Miss Wells," she said gently, her voice cutting through the hall's tension like a soft breeze. "You must notice so much during your tours. The visitors, their questions. Do any stand out from yesterday?" Clara's cheeks flushed slightly, and she glanced at Miss Marple, as if surprised by the question's gentleness. "Well, there was Mr. Trent, of course. He's been coming often these past weeks, always asking about the Haverford sword, its history, its craftsmanship. He was on the last tour yesterday, lingering by the case longer than most." Harrow's mustache twitched. "Lingering, you say? Did he seem overly interested?" Clara hesitated, twisting her scarf. "I suppose so. He asked if the sword had ever been removed from the case for study, and whether the lock was secure. I thought he was just curious. Some visitors are like that, you know, especially the history buffs." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of kindly interest. "And you answered his questions naturally. You're so good with the visitors, Miss Wells. Did Mr. Trent speak with anyone else during the tour? Sir Cedric, perhaps?" Clara's eyes widened slightly, then darted toward the knight reenactor, who stood polishing his replica sword with exaggerated nonchalance. "Not that I saw," she said quickly. "Sir Cedric was in the courtyard most of the afternoon, practicing his sword play. He doesn't usually mingle with the tour groups." Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. Clara's quick denial was telling, not in its content, but in its haste. She recalled Lady Conway's description of Clara as a darling girl, beloved by all. Yet popularity could mask secrets, and Clara's role gave her access to the hall, the alarm code, and the trust of the castle's staff. Miss Marple's mind turned over the possibilities, her thoughts as precise as her stitches. Harrow pressed on. "You locked the hall, you say, and the alarm. Was it set when you left?" "Yes, sir," Clara replied, her voice firmer now. "I entered the code myself. Mr. Grayson was still in his office when I left, but the hall was secure. I'd swear to it." "And you saw no one else?" Harrow's tone was skeptical. "No stragglers, no visitors who might have slipped back in?" Clara shook her head, but her fingers tightened on her scarf. "No one. The castle was quiet. I went home right after." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind remained sharp. "You live nearby, don't you, Miss Wells? It must be a comfort to be so close to the castle, though I imagine it feels like a second home to you." Clara smiled faintly, the first trace of her usual warmth returning. "It does, in a way. I've worked here 3 years, and I love it, the history, the stories, but it's a big responsibility, too. I'd never do anything to harm the castle's treasures." "Of course not," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. But her thoughts were elsewhere, lingering on Clara's mention of Trent's questions about the lock. A curious visitor was one thing, but a visitor probing the security of a priceless artifact was another. And Clara's familiarity with the castle's routines made her a potential ally or accomplice in any scheme. As Harrow jotted notes, Miss Marple rose and approached the display case once more, her movements slow but purposeful. The drag marks she had noticed earlier were still visible, faint traces in the dust that led toward the alcove with the suit of armor. She paused, her eyes scanning the glass case. The lock, as Grayson had confirmed, was intact, but she noticed something new, a faint smudge on the glass. Not a fingerprint, but a slight blur, as if someone had brushed against it with a cloth or sleeve. It was near the bottom, where one might lean while working on the lock. She made a mental note, her mind weaving this new detail into the growing tapestry of clues. Returning to her bench, she glanced at the suspects. Harold Grayson, now seated near the hall's entrance, was scribbling furiously in a notebook, his tic more pronounced than ever. Sir Cedric, still polishing his sword, caught her eye and offered a theatrical scowl, as if daring her to suspect him. Lionel Trent, ever the shadow, had moved closer to the alcove, his hands still buried in his pockets, and Clara, now dismissed by Harrow, stood near a tapestry, her scarf a tangled mess, her eyes darting between the inspector and the empty case. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a counterpoint to the hall's tension. Clara's account was plausible, but her hesitation when asked about Trent and Sir Cedric suggested she knew more than she was saying. Was it loyalty to a colleague, fear of implicating a visitor, or something else entirely? Miss Marple thought of her own village, St. Mary Mead, where young women like Clara often hid their worries behind bright smiles. A kind word, a gentle question, could sometimes unlock more than a stern interrogation. Harrow, meanwhile, was preparing to question Sir Cedric. The knight reenactor strode forward, his armor clanking, his presence filling the hall with an almost comical grandeur. Miss Marple watched, her mind already sifting through Clara's words. The guide's charm was undeniable, but charm, she knew, could be a mask as effective as any. The Haverford sword was gone, and Clara's role in locking the hall placed her at the heart of the mystery. Whether she was a pawn, a witness, or something more, Miss Marple was determined to find out. Chapter 5. The Knight's Swagger. The great hall of Haverford Castle, with its ancient stones and flickering torchlight, seemed to brace itself as Sir Cedric Blake strode forward, his replica armor clanking with every step. The sound echoed off the vaulted ceiling, a brash counterpoint to the morning's grim discovery. Miss Jane Marple, seated on her bench by the leaded window, her knitting needles moving with their quiet, relentless rhythm, watched the night reenactor with keen interest. His theatrical presence, she thought, was as much a performance as his daily reenactments, and performances often hid truths as effectively as they revealed them. Sir Cedric was a towering figure, his broad shoulders accentuated by the polished steel of his armor, a meticulously crafted replica of a 15th-century knight's garb. His face, ruddy and framed by a neatly trimmed beard, bore an expression of indignant pride, as if the very suggestion of his involvement in the theft of the Haverford sword were an insult to his honor. Yet Miss Marple noted the slight tension in his jaw, the way his eyes flicked toward the empty display case before settling on Inspector Harrow with a defiant glare. "Sir Cedric," Harrow began, his tone heavy with skepticism, "you were here late last night, practicing your swordplay, I'm told. Care to explain what you were doing in the great hall after hours?" Cedric's chest puffed out, his voice booming through the hall. "Practicing my craft, Inspector. A knight's duty is to embody the spirit of Sir Rowland de Haverford, to bring history alive for the visitors. I was perfecting my routine in the courtyard, and I may have stepped into the hall briefly to check my props." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Your props, Sir Cedric?" she asked, her voice soft but piercing. "You keep them here, in the hall? Near the sword's case, perhaps?" Cedric's gaze snapped to her, a flash of unease crossing his face before he masked it with a hearty laugh. "Not near the case, Miss Marple. My props are stored in the armory, but I sometimes bring my sword, a replica, mind you, to the hall for authenticity. The visitors love it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite curiosity. "And your replica sword. It's quite like the Haverford sword, isn't it? Lady Conway mentioned you were proud of its craftsmanship." Cedric's eyes lit up, his pride overtaking his caution. "Indeed it is. Forged by a master in York, down to the last detail. The hilt's not jeweled, of course, but it's a fine piece. I showed it to the staff last week. Clara was quite taken with it." Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady clicking, but her mind was racing. A replica, so close to the original, could serve many purposes: admiration, distraction, or deception. She glanced at Clara Wells, who stood near a tapestry, her scarf now a hopeless knot. The guide's cheeks flushed slightly at the mention of her name, but she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the floor. Harrow, unimpressed by Cedric's bluster, pressed on. "You were seen in the hall after closing, Sir Cedric. Miss Wells locked up at 5:30, and Mr. Grayson left at 10. Where were you between those hours?" Cedric's armor clinked as he shifted his weight. "In the courtyard, mostly. I finished my practice around 7, then went to the armory to store my gear. I was home by 8. You can ask my landlady. She'll vouch for me." Harrow's mustache twitched. "We will. And you saw nothing unusual? No one near the sword's case?" "Preposterous," Cedric exclaimed, his voice rising. I'd have noticed anyone tampering with that sacred relic. The Haverford sword is the soul of this castle. I'd protect it with my life." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "Such passion, Sir Cedric. You must know the sword's value, not just as history, but to collectors. A man of your theatrical flair might understand how such a treasure could tempt others." Cedric's face reddened, his indignation almost palpable. "Tempt others? Never. I honor Sir Roland's legacy, not some black market profiteer's greed. I'd sooner sell my own armor than touch that sword." His words rang through the hall, drawing glances from the other suspects. Harold Grayson, still scribbling in his notebook, paused, his tic more pronounced. Clara Wells twisted her scarf tighter, her eyes darting to Cedric before dropping again. Lionel Trent, lingering near the alcove, seemed to shrink further into his coat, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple noted each reaction, her mind weaving their silences and gestures into the growing pattern of the mystery. Harrow dismissed Cedric with a curt nod, turning to his constable. "Check the armory for his props, and get that landlady's statement." He glanced at Miss Marple, his tone grudging. "Anything to add, Miss Marple?" She smiled, her needles never faltering. "Only that Sir Cedric's devotion to his role is most impressive. But roles, like armor, can sometimes conceal as much as they reveal, don't you think?" Harrow frowned, unsure whether she was mocking him, but Miss Marple was already rising, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. She approached the display case once more, her eyes drawn to the faint smudge she had noticed earlier. It was still there, a subtle blur near the lock, as if someone had brushed against the glass with care. She knelt, her gaze shifting to the drag marks in the dust, which led toward the alcove. The suit of armor stood as before, slightly askew, its visor casting a shadow that seemed to guard its secrets. She examined the plinth, noting a faint scratch on its edge, barely visible but distinct. A mark that suggested something had been moved, perhaps hastily. Stepping back, she glanced at the alcove's floor, where the scuff mark she had seen earlier remained. It was not unlike the drag marks near the case, and she wondered if the thief had used the alcove as a temporary hiding place. Or was it a deliberate misdirection, meant to draw attention away from the true method of the theft? She tucked the thought away, her mind returning to Cedric's words. His replica sword, so proudly displayed, was a curious detail. A blade so similar to the original could confuse a casual observer or an accomplice, and his late presence in the hall, however he explained it, placed him at the scene. As she returned to her bench, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the other suspects. Grayson's nervousness, Clara's hesitation, Trent's reticence. Each was a thread in the tapestry, but Cedric's swagger was a bold pattern, demanding attention. She recalled a young man in St. Mary Mead, a local actor fond of grand gestures, who had once hidden a petty theft behind his charm. Cedric's performance was grander, but the principle was the same. Bravado could mask guilt as surely as silence could. Harrow, meanwhile, was preparing to question Lionel Trent. The visitor shuffled forward, his hands still buried in his pockets, his eyes avoiding the inspectors. Miss Marple watched, her needles clicking softly. Cedric's outburst had revealed much: his pride, his defensiveness, his knowledge of the sword's allure. Whether he was the thief or merely a distraction, she was certain he held a piece of the puzzle. The Haverford sword was hidden, but its trail was growing clearer, and Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to follow it to the end. Chapter 6. The visitors shadow the great hall of Haverford Castle, with its ancient stones and somber tapestries, seemed to grow quieter as Inspector Harrow turned his attention to Lionel Trent, the unassuming visitor whose frequent presence had drawn Lady Conway's suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated on her bench by the leaded window, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm, watched Trent closely. His reticence, she thought, was as telling as Sir Cedric's bluster or Clara's charm, a shadow cast by a man who preferred to go unnoticed, yet whose actions had placed him squarely in the mystery's spotlight. Lionel Trent was a man of middle years, his drab overcoat and stooped posture blending into the hall's gloom like a figure from a faded photograph. His face, unremarkable save for the sharp glint in his eyes when they briefly met Miss Marple's, suggested a mind accustomed to observing rather than being observed. His hands remained buried in his pockets, a habit Miss Marple noted with interest, as if he were guarding something, perhaps only his thoughts, perhaps something more tangible. "Mr. Trent," Harrow began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "You were here yesterday, on the last tour with Miss Wells. You've been visiting often, I'm told. Care to explain your interest in the Haverford sword?" Trent's shoulders twitched slightly, but his voice was steady, almost too measured. "I'm a history enthusiast, Inspector. The sword is a remarkable artifact, 15th century craftsmanship, tied to Sir Roland de Haverford. I've been studying the Wars of the Roses, and Haverford Castle is a treasure trove, that's all." Harrow's mustache bristled, his skepticism plain. "A treasure trove, eh? And you were seen lingering by the sword's case yesterday, asking questions about its security, according to Miss Wells. That's more than casual interest, wouldn't you say?" Trent's eyes flicked to Clara, who stood near a tapestry, her scarf now a crumpled knot in her hands. "I asked about the sword's history," he said, his tone clipped. "Its provenance, its craftsmanship. I may have asked about the case, out of curiosity, nothing more." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her needles pausing. "Curiosity is such a natural thing, Mr. Trent," she said, her voice gentle as a summer breeze. "You must have spoken with others about the sword. Sir Cedric, perhaps? He shares your passion for history, I understand." Trent's gaze met hers for a moment, and she caught a flicker of calculation before he looked away. "We've spoken once or twice," he admitted. "He's enthusiastic about his role. Likes to talk about the sword's legacy, how he embodies it in his performances." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of kindly interest, but her mind was sifting through his words. Trent's reticence was a contrast to Cedric's flamboyance, yet both men shared an interest in the sword that went beyond admiration. She recalled Lady Conway's unease about Trent's frequent visits, his lingering presence by the case. A history enthusiast was one thing, but a man asking about locks and security was another. And his brief conversations with Cedric, casual or carefully planned? Harrow pressed on, his tone growing sharper. "You left before the hall closed yesterday, you say. Can anyone confirm that?" Trent hesitated, his hands shifting in his pockets. I left around 5, I think, before Miss Wells locked up. I didn't stay long after the tour." "You think?" Harrow's eyes narrowed. "That's not much of an answer, Mr. Trent. Were you alone, or did you speak with anyone on your way out?" Trent's jaw tightened, but he shook his head. "I left alone. I don't recall speaking to anyone." Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet clicking, but her thoughts were racing. Trent's vagueness about his departure was a loose thread, one she intended to tug. She glanced at Clara, whose eyes darted away as if reluctant to meet Trent's gaze. Was it guilt, fear, or simply the strain of the morning? Miss Marple thought of a young man in St. Mary Mead, a quiet sort who had once slipped away from a village fete with a stolen silver tray, unnoticed because he was so unremarkable. Trent's shadow-like presence reminded her of him, a man who could move through a crowd without drawing attention, yet whose actions might leave traces. Harrow scribbled in his notebook, his frustration evident. "You've been here often, Mr. Trent. Every week, Lady Conway says. That's a lot of visits for a history enthusiast. You wouldn't happen to know any collectors, would you? People who might pay a pretty penny for a sword like that?" Trent's face remained impassive, but his hands clenched in his pockets. "I study history, Inspector, not trade in it. I've no connections to collectors." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "Of course, Mr. Trent. But history can be so compelling, can't it? It draws people together, enthusiasts, scholars, even those with less honorable intentions. Have you ever met anyone like that during your visits?" Trent's eyes flicked to her again, and for a moment she thought he might speak, but he shook his head, his voice low. "No, Miss Marple, just other visitors, like myself." Harrow dismissed him with a grunt, turning to his constable. "Check the visitor logs. See how often Mr. Trent's been here and who he's been seen with." He glanced at Miss Marple, his tone grudging. "Anything else, Miss Marple?" She smiled, her needles never faltering. "Only that Mr. Trent's interest in the sword is most dedicated, but dedication, like curiosity, can sometimes lead us down unexpected paths, don't you think?" Harrow frowned, but Miss Marple was already rising, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. She approached the alcove near the suit of armor, where she had noticed the scuff mark and the faint scratch on the plinth. The black thread she had found earlier was still in her handkerchief, and now she examined the alcove more closely. The armor's visor was closed, its gauntlets empty, but she noticed a slight indentation in the dust at its base, as if something had rested there briefly. A bag, perhaps, or a case. She knelt, her fingers brushing the stone, and found another tiny fragment. This one a sliver of wood, polished and dark, caught in a crevice. She tucked it away, her mind turning over its significance. A tool? A container? Or something else entirely? As she stood, she glanced at the suspects. Harold Grayson, still scribbling in his notebook, seemed lost in his own thoughts, his tick a constant twitch. Clara Wells, near the tapestry, was unraveling her scarf, her eyes darting between Trent and the empty case. Sir Cedric Blake, polishing his replica sword with renewed vigor, caught her gaze and offered a theatrical nod, as if to assert his innocence. Trent, however, had retreated to the hall's edge, his hands still in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the floor. His shadow-like presence, Miss Marple thought, was a puzzle in itself. Quiet, but not invisible. She returned to her bench, her needles clicking softly. Trent's reticence, his frequent visits, his questions about the sword's security, they were all threads in the tapestry, but they did not yet form a clear picture. She thought of the alcove, the drag marks, the smudge on the case, the sliver of wood. Each was a clue, small but significant, and Trent's role in the theft, if he had one, was tied to them. Was he the thief, an accomplice, or merely a curious bystander caught in the wrong place? Miss Marple's mind turned to the other suspects. their motives and opportunities interwoven like the stitches in her knitting. The Haverford sword was hidden, but its shadow lingered, and Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to bring it into the light. Chapter 7. A Clue in the Dust. The great hall of Haverford Castle, with its ancient stones and heavy air, seemed to pulse with secrets as the morning wore on. The empty display case, once the proud home of the Haverford sword, stood like a silent witness, its pristine glass reflecting the flickering torchlight and the tense faces of those gathered. Miss Jane Marple, seated on her bench by the leaded window, her knitting needles clicking with their ceaseless rhythm, watched the scene. With her characteristic blend of quiet observation and razor-sharp insight, Inspector Harrow, his patience fraying, was conferring with his constable, while the suspects, Harold Grayson, Clara Wells, Sir Cedric Blake, and Lionel Trent, remained in their respective corners, each a study in unease. Miss Marple's mind, however, was not on the interrogations, which had yielded more questions than answers. Her thoughts lingered on the physical traces of the crime, the drag marks in the dust, the smudge on the glass, the black thread, and the sliver of wood she had found in the alcove. These were the silent voices of the theft, and she was determined to listen. Rising from her bench, her movements slow but purposeful, she approached the display case once more, her knitting bag tucked under her arm like a faithful companion. The hall was quieter now, the initial shock of the sword's disappearance giving way to a restless anticipation. Harrow's constable was examining the visitor logs, while the inspector himself was muttering about the need for fingerprints. Miss Marple, however, knew that the truth often lay in less obvious clues. She knelt beside the case, her eyes tracing the faint drag marks she had noticed earlier. They were subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye, but to Miss Marple they were as clear as a footprint in soft earth. The marks began at the base of the case and stretched toward the alcove, where the suit of armor stood slightly askew. "Look here, Inspector," she called softly, her voice carrying just enough to draw Harrow's attention without startling the others. "These marks in the dust, do you see them? They're not footprints, but they suggest something was moved. Something heavy, perhaps." Harrow strode over, his heavy boots echoing on the stone floor. He crouched beside her, his brow furrowing as he followed her gaze. "Drag marks, you say? Could be the case itself was shifted. But the sword's light enough to carry? Why drag anything?" Miss Marple's lips curved faintly, her eyes never leaving the marks. The sword alone? Yes. But what if it was removed with something else? A container, perhaps, to conceal it, or a tool used to open the case? Harrow's mustache twitched, his skepticism tempered by a grudging respect. "You're thinking they hid it in something bulky? That'd explain the marks, but not why they'd bother. The case wasn't broken. Someone had a key or picked the lock clean." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of the case. The smudge she had noticed earlier was still there, a faint blur near the lock, as if someone had brushed against it with a cloth or sleeve. But now, her attention was drawn to a new detail, a tiny scratch, barely a hair's breadth, on the case's metal frame, just below the lock. It was so small it might have been overlooked, but to Miss Marple, it was a shout in the silence. "This scratch, Inspector," she said, pointing. "It's fresh, don't you think? Not the work of a clumsy hand, but a careful one. A tool, perhaps, used with precision." Harrow squinted, his face close to the case. Could be a picklock's mark, or a key that didn't quite fit. Grayson's got the key, and Lady Conway, though she swears hers is in her safe. We'll check both. Miss Marple straightened, her gaze drifting to the alcove. The suit of armor, its visor closed and its gauntlets empty, seemed to guard its secrets. She approached it, her eyes scanning. The plinth, the faint scratch she had noticed before, was still there, and the scuff mark in the dust suggested something had been moved, perhaps the armor itself, or something hidden behind it. She knelt again, her fingers brushing the stone, and found another clue. A speck of wax, no larger than a pinhead, lodged in a crack. It was pale, almost translucent, and smelled faintly of beeswax. She tucked it into her handkerchief alongside the black thread and the sliver of wood, her mind turning over their significance. Wax could mean a candle, a seal, or even a polish used to conceal traces. Standing, she glanced at the suspects. Harold Grayson, still scribbling in his notebook, seemed oblivious to the hall's tension, his tick a constant flutter. Clara Wells, her scarf now a hopeless tangle, was speaking quietly with Lady Conway, her eyes darting toward the case. Sir Cedric Blake, polishing his replica sword with theatrical flourishes, caught her gaze and offered a defiant nod. Lionel Trent, ever the shadow, lingered near the alcove, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple returned to her bench, her needles resuming their rhythm. The clues, the drag marks, the smudge, the scratch, the thread, the wood, the wax, were pieces of a puzzle, each pointing to a careful, calculated theft. The lock's pristine condition suggested someone with a key or skill, and the alarm's silence implied knowledge of its code. Grayson and Clara had access to both, but Cedric's late presence and Trent's probing questions could not be dismissed. She thought of a theft in St. Mary Mead, years ago, when a silver candlestick vanished from the vicarage. The thief, a quiet parishioner, had used a wax seal to mask his tampering, a detail that had seemed trivial until it unraveled the case. Was the wax here a similar key? Harrow, meanwhile, was barking orders to his constable. "Get that case dusted for prints and check the alarm logs. I want to know who touched what and when." He turned to Miss Marple, his tone grudging. "You've got a sharp eye, Miss Marple. That scratch could be something. But I'm betting on Grayson. He's got the key, the code, and the run of the place." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking softly. "Mr. Grayson is certainly dedicated, Inspector, but dedication can blind us, can't it, to what's happening in the shadows?" Harrow grunted, unsure whether she was agreeing or deflecting. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were on the alcove. The armor's slight misalignment, the scuff mark, the wax, they suggested a hiding place, or perhaps a diversion. Had the thief used the alcove to conceal the sword temporarily, or to stage a misdirection? And the wax, could it be from a tool, a seal, or something as simple as a candle used to work in the dark? She recalled Clara's mention of Trent's questions about the lock, Cedric's replica sword, Grayson's late hours. Each suspect was a thread, and the clues in the dust were the needle pulling them together. As Harrow prepared to re-examine the alarm system, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the suspects. Grayson's scribbling, Clara's nervous glances, Cedric's bravado, Trent's silence. Each was a piece of the tapestry, but the pattern was not yet clear. The Haverford sword was gone, but its trail was etched in the dust, and Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to follow it to the truth. Chapter 8. The Knight's Secrets. The great hall of Haverford Castle, with its ancient stones and somber tapestries, seemed to draw inward as the morning gave way to a gray, overcast afternoon. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and wax, and the flickering torchlight cast long shadows that danced across the empty display case where the Haverford sword had once rested. Miss Jane Marple, seated on her bench by the leaded window, her knitting needles moving with their steady, almost meditative rhythm, felt the weight of the mystery deepening. The clues she had gathered, the drag marks, the smudge, the scratch, the black thread, the sliver of wood, the speck of wax, were like scattered notes in a melody, waiting for her to find the tune. But it was the timeline of the previous night, she knew, that held the key to the sword's disappearance. Inspector Harrow, his patience worn thin by the suspect's evasive answers, had retreated to a corner of the hall to confer with his constable, who was poring over the alarm logs. The suspects, Harold Grayson, Clara Wells, Sir Cedric Blake, and Lionel Trent, remained under watchful eyes, their movements restricted to the hall and its adjacent chambers. Miss Marple, however, was less concerned with their present demeanor than with their actions in the hours before the theft. She rose, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, and approached Lady Beatrice Conway, who stood near a tapestry, her face etched with worry. "Beatrice," Miss Marple said softly, her voice a gentle contrast to the hall's tension, "might we have a word? I'd like to understand the castle's routines last night, if you please. Every detail matters, you know?" Lady Conway nodded, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. "Of course, Jane. Anything to help. It's all so dreadful. I can hardly think straight." They moved to a quieter corner, near a window overlooking the courtyard, where the gray light softened the lines of Lady Conway's anxious face. Miss Marple settled onto a cushioned chair, her needles never pausing. "Let's start with the closing of the castle," she said. "The last tour ended at 5, I believe, and Clara locked the great hall. Mr. Grayson was working late until 10, and Sir Cedric was practicing his sword play. Is that correct?" "Yes," Lady Conway replied, her voice low. "Clara's tours always end promptly. She's very reliable. She locks the hall and sets the alarm, though Harold often checks it before he leaves. He's so particular about the artifacts. As for Cedric, he's often in the courtyard until dusk, clanking about with that replica sword of his. I saw him there myself yesterday, just before 6. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "And Mr. Trenta. He was on the last tour, but no one seemed certain when he left." Lady Conway frowned, her handkerchief twisting tighter. "I saw him in the hall during the tour, lingering by the sword's case. He's been so curious about it lately, always asking questions. I assumed he left with the other visitors, but, well, I didn't see him go." Miss Marple nodded, her mind sifting through the timeline. The castle closed at 6. Clara locked the hall at 5:30. Grayson set the alarms at 10, and Cedric was in the courtyard until at least 6. Trent's departure was unconfirmed, a gap in the narrative that nagged at her. She thought of a burglary in St. Mary Mead, where a gardener's vague account of his evening stroll had concealed his role in a theft. Gaps, she knew, were often where the truth hid. "Beatrice," she continued, her tone as gentle as ever, "you mentioned Cedric's new replica sword. He showed it off last week, didn't he? Quite proudly, I understand." Lady Conway's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, yes. He was insufferable about it, said it was forged to match the Haverford sword exactly, minus the emerald, of course. He showed it to Clara, Harold, even me. Clara seemed impressed, but Harold was dismissive, called it a gaudy imitation. Cedric was quite put out. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the detail. A replica sword, so like the original, could serve as more than a prop. It could be a decoy, a distraction, or even a placeholder to delay discovery of the theft. She recalled the smudge on the case, the scratch on the frame, the wax in the alcove. Could the replica have been used to mask the sword's absence, even briefly? And if so, who had the opportunity to make the switch? She glanced across the hall, where the suspects remained under Harrow's watchful eye. Harold Grayson, still scribbling in his notebook, seemed lost in his own world, his tick a constant flutter. Clara Wells, her scarf now a hopeless tangle, was speaking quietly with the constable, her eyes darting nervously. Sir Cedric Blake, polishing his replica sword with exaggerated care, caught her gaze and offered a theatrical flourish, as if to assert his innocence. Lionel Trent, ever the shadow, lingered near the alcove, his hands still in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the night's timeline. "Beatrice," she said, "when you saw Cedric in the courtyard, was he alone? And did you notice anyone else about the castle after closing?" Lady Conway hesitated, her brow furrowing. "Cedric was alone, I think. The courtyard was quiet. Most of the staff had gone home. But, now that you mention it, I did see a light in Harold's office window as I left for the evening, around 7. And there was a figure in the garden, near the gate. I thought it was one of the groundskeepers, but it could have been someone else." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind weaving the new information into the tapestry. A figure in the garden, a light in Grayson's office, Cedric in the courtyard, Trent's uncertain departure. Each was a thread, and the night's secrets were beginning to unravel. She thought of the alcove, the drag marks, the wax. The speck of wax, in particular, intrigued her. Was it from a candle used to work in the dark? Or perhaps a polish, applied to conceal traces on the case? She recalled the sliver of wood, the black thread. Small clues, but each a step closer to the truth. Rising, she approached the alcove once more, her eyes scanning the suit of armor. The faint scratch on the plinth, the scuff mark in the dust, the indentation where something had rested. They suggested the alcove had played a role, however brief. She knelt, her fingers brushing the stone, and found another clue. A tiny fleck of green paint caught in a crack near the scuff mark. It was vibrant, unlike the castle's muted tones, and she tucked it into her handkerchief alongside her other finds. Green paint could mean anything, a tool, a container, even a prop from Cedric's reenactments. But its presence in the alcove was no accident. As she stood, Inspector Harrow approached, his face a mix of frustration and curiosity. "Miss Marple, you're poking about again. Found something else in the dust?" She smiled, her needles clicking softly. "Only a trifle, Inspector. A fleck of paint, perhaps nothing. But the night's secrets are often hidden in such trifles, don't you think?" Harrow grunted, his eyes narrowing. "I'm more interested in hard evidence. The alarm logs show no tampering, and Grayson's key is still in his safe. Lady Conway's is in hers. If someone picked that lock, they're a professional." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "A professional, or someone with knowledge of the castle's ways. The night was busy, it seems. Cedric in the courtyard, Grayson in his office, a figure in the garden, and Mr. Trent, perhaps, lingering longer than he admits. Harrow's mustache twitched. "You're thinking Trent's our man? He's slippery, I'll give you that." "Not yet, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "But the night's secrets are speaking, if we listen, and I believe they have more to say." As Harrow returned to his constable, Miss Marple settled back on her bench, her needles moving steadily. The timeline was taking shape. Clara's locking of the hall, Grayson's late hours, Cedric's practice, Trent's uncertain departure, the figure in the garden. The clues in the dust, thread, wood, wax, paint, were fragments of a larger truth, and the replica sword loomed large in her thoughts. The Haverford sword was hidden, but its trail was growing clearer, and Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to follow it to the end. Chapter 9. The Market for Relics. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the leaded windows of Haverford Castle's great hall, casting a muted glow over the ancient stones and the empty display case that had once held the Haverford sword. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the low murmur of Inspector Harrow's consultations with his constable and the occasional clink of Sir Cedric Blake's armor as he shifted restlessly. Miss Jane Marple, seated on her bench by the window, her knitting needles moving with their quiet, relentless rhythm, felt the mystery's threads drawing tighter. The clues she had gathered, the drag marks, the smudge, the scratch, the black thread, the sliver of wood, the speck of wax, the fleck of green paint, were like stitches in a tapestry, each adding depth to the pattern. But it was the world beyond the castle, the shadowy market for relics, that now called for her attention. Miss Marple knew that a treasure like the Haverford sword, with its emerald-encrusted hilt and storied history, was not stolen for mere admiration. Its value lay not only in its craftsmanship, but in the fortunes it could command among collectors, those secretive figures who coveted relics for pride or profit. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen antique brooch had surfaced in a London auction house, its thief lured by whispered promises of wealth. The sword, she suspected, was destined for a similar fate, and to find it, she needed to understand the market that beckoned it. With Lady Conway's permission, Miss Marple slipped away from the great hall, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, and made her way to the castle library, a small, book-lined room that served as Lady Conway's private office. The telephone, an old-fashioned device with a gleaming rotary dial, sat on a mahogany desk, and Miss Marple settled into a chair, her needles never pausing. She placed a call to an old acquaintance in London, Mr. Percival Fortescue, a retired antiquarian with a knack for hearing whispers in the world of rare artifacts. His voice, when he answered, was as crisp as ever, tinged with the delight of an unexpected call. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, "what a pleasure! Are you in London, or still unraveling mysteries in that village of yours?" "Neither, Mr. Fortescue," she replied, her tone light but purposeful. "I'm at Haverford Castle, where a rather valuable sword has gone missing, the Haverford sword, 15th century, with an emerald in its hilt. I wondered if you might have heard anything about such a piece in your circles." Fortescue's tone grew serious. "The Haverford sword? My word, that's a prize. I haven't heard of it surfacing, but the market for medieval weapons has been buzzing lately. Collectors are ravenous, private buyers, mostly, who don't care much for provenance if the price is right. There's a dealer in London, a fellow named Carver, who's been asking about swords of that era. Shady type, works through middlemen to keep his hands clean. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind seizing on the name. Carver, you say? Has he been active recently? Very, Fortescue replied. Word is he's got a buyer lined up for a high-value piece, something unique, with a gemstone hilt. He's been cagey, but that's his way. If your sword's been stolen, Miss Marple, I'd wager it's headed his way, though he'd never touch it himself. He uses intermediaries, often enthusiasts or amateurs who don't ask too many questions. Miss Marple thanked him, her thoughts already racing. An intermediary, someone with a passion for history or a need for money, could fit any of her suspects. Grayson with his obsession, Clara with her access, Cedric with his flair, or Trent with his shadowy curiosity. She returned to the great hall, her mind weaving Fortescue's information into the tapestry of clues. The market for relics was the motive, she was certain, and the thief, or thieves, had acted with a buyer in mind. Back in the hall, Inspector Harrow was reviewing the alarm logs, his face a mask of frustration. The suspects remained under watch, their unease palpable. Harold Grayson, still scribbling in his notebook, seemed to shrink into himself, his tic a constant flutter. Clara Wells, her scarf now abandoned on a chair, was speaking quietly with Lady Conway, her eyes darting toward the alcove. Sir Cedric Blake, his armor gleaming, was pacing near the display case, muttering about honor and legacy. Lionel Trent, ever the shadow, lingered near the hall's edge, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the floor. Miss Marple approached Harrow, her voice gentle but firm. Inspector, have you considered the sword's destination? A relic like that isn't stolen for display in a cottage parlor. There's a market for such things, I'm told. A dealer in London, perhaps, with a buyer waiting. Harrow's mustache twitched, his interest piqued. A dealer, you say? Got a name? Carver, she replied, her needles clicking. A man who works through others, according to my source. The sword may already be on its way to him, or to someone he's chosen. Harrow nodded, scribbling in his notebook. We'll look into it. If there's a buyer, we might catch the thief trying to make the sale. But we need evidence, something solid. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. Evidence is often in the small things, Inspector. A thread, a speck of wax, a fleck of paint. They tell a story if we listen. She glanced at the alcove where the suit of armor stood, its visor hiding its secrets. The green paint she had found there nagged at her, a vibrant hue, out of place in the castle's muted palette. She thought of Cedric's replica sword, its hilt perhaps painted for effect, or a tool used in the theft, its handle coated in green. Or was it something simpler, a crate, a bag, a prop from the reenactments? She recalled Clara's mention of Cedric's pride in his replica, Grayson's dismissal of it, Trent's questions about the lock. The market for relics was the destination, but the path to it lay through the castle's night. Miss Marple settled back on her bench, her needles moving steadily. She thought of the timeline. Clara locking the hall at 5:30, Grayson working until 10, Cedric in the courtyard until 6, Trent's uncertain departure, the figure in the garden. The clues, the drag marks, the smudge, the scratch, the thread, the wood, the wax, the paint, were fragments of a plan, and the market for relics was its purpose. Someone in the hall knew more than they admitted, and she suspected it was not one alone. A theft of this precision required knowledge, access, and perhaps collaboration. As Harrow dispatched his constable to contact the London police about Carver, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the suspects. Grayson's scribbling, Clara's nervous glances, Cedric's pacing, Trent's silence. Each was a thread, and the market for relics was the loom on which they were woven. The Haverford sword was hidden, but its trail was growing clearer, and Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to follow it to the truth. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The great hall of Haverford Castle, bathed in the dim glow of late afternoon, seemed to hold its breath as the threads of the mystery drew taut. The empty display case, once the proud home of the Haverford sword, stood as a silent accusation, its glass reflecting the flickering torchlight and the strained faces of those gathered within. Miss Jane Marple, seated on her bench by the leaded window, her knitting needles clicking with their relentless rhythm, felt the moment approaching, a moment when the clues she had gathered, the subtle hints of human nature, would force the truth into the open. The drag marks, the smudge, the scratch, the black thread, the sliver of wood, the speck of wax, the fleck of green paint, all were pieces of a puzzle, and now, with the market for relics looming as the motive, she was ready to weave them into a revelation. Inspector Harrow, his patience worn thin by the day's interrogations, had gathered the suspects, Harold Grayson, Clara Wells, Sir Cedric Blake, and Lionel Trent, in the center of the hall. His constable stood by the door, a notebook in hand, while Lady Beatrice Conway hovered nearby, her lace handkerchief twisted into a knot. The air was thick with anticipation, the suspect's eyes darting between Harrow's stern gaze and Miss Marple's serene presence. She rose, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, and stepped forward, her voice gentle, but carrying the weight of certainty. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone as calm as if she were discussing the weather in St. Mary Mead. "The theft of the Haverford sword is a puzzle, but not an unsolvable one. It is, after all, a matter of human nature, and human nature is much the same, whether in a village or a castle. The sword was taken not for love, but for profit, a prize destined for a shadowy market, where collectors pay fortunes for such relics. But, to find it, we must look to the night it vanished, and to the small things that betray the thief." Harrow's mustache twitched, his eyes narrowing with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "Go on, Miss Marple. You've got something up your sleeve, I can tell." She smiled faintly, her needles pausing for a moment. "Let us begin with the facts. The sword was in its case at 5, when Miss Wells locked the hall. Mr. Grayson was working until 10, when he set the alarms. Sir Cedric was in the courtyard until 6, practicing his swordplay. And Mr. Trent was on the last tour, his departure uncertain. The case shows no signs of force, the lock a faint scratch, the alarm silent. Yet there are drag marks in the dust, leading to the alcove, where a suit of armor stands slightly askew. A black thread, a sliver of wood, a speck of wax, a fleck of green paint. These are the clues that tell the story. She turned to the suspects, her gaze resting on each in turn. "Mr. Grayson, you are a man of precision, devoted to the castle's treasures. Yet your nervousness suggests more than shock. Did you see something that night? Something you've not shared?" Grayson's tick flared, his hands clutching his notebook. "I've told you everything. I was in my office, cataloging. The sword was there when I left. I'd never harm it." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes moving to Clara. Miss Wells, you locked the hall and set the alarm. You're trusted by all, yet you hesitated when asked about Mr. Trent's departure. Was there something you noticed, perhaps, that you thought unimportant? Clara's cheeks flushed, her hands twisting her abandoned scarf. I didn't see him leave, but I thought he had. I was busy locking up. I didn't think it mattered. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Sir Cedric, whose armor clinked as he straightened. Sir Cedric, your passion for history is admirable, but your replica sword, so like the Haverford sword, raises questions. You were in the hall after hours, near the case. Did you perhaps see an opportunity to turn your performance into profit? Cedric's face reddened, his voice booming. Preposterous! I'd never defile Sir Roland's legacy. My replica is just that, a replica. I was practicing nothing more. Miss Marple's eyes finally settled on Lionel Trent, whose hands remained buried in his pockets, his expression a mask of quiet defiance. Mr. Trent, your interest in the sword was more than scholarly, I think. Your questions about the lock, your frequent visits, they suggest a connection to those who trade in relics. Did you know of a dealer named Carver? Perhaps? Trent's eyes flickered, but he shook his head. I'm a historian, Miss Marple. I study. I don't steal. Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, her voice steady. The clues tell a different story. The drag marks suggest the case was moved, perhaps to conceal the theft's timing. The scratch on the lock points to a tool, not a key. The wax, the wood, the paint, they hint at a container, perhaps a prop, used to hide the sword. And the thread, black and fine, matches the lining of a bag I noticed in the armory near Sir Cedric's props. She paused, her gaze sweeping the hall. The sword was taken after Miss Wells locked the hall, but before Mr. Grayson set the alarms. Sir Cedric, you were in the courtyard, but you entered the hall briefly, didn't you? To store your props, you said. But what if you used that moment to open the case with a tool borrowed from Mr. Grayson's office? The wax suggests you worked by candlelight to avoid detection. The green paint, perhaps from your replica's hilt, or a crate you used to conceal the sword, links you to the alcove where you hid it temporarily. Cedric's face paled, his armor clinking as he stepped back. This is madness. I'd never. Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice gentle but firm. Mr. Trent, you knew of Carver's interest in the sword. You've been seen speaking with Sir Cedric, haven't you? Not just as a visitor, but as a go-between, tempted by a share of the profits. Trent's hands clenched in his pockets, his voice low. You've no proof, Miss Marple. She smiled, her eyes twinkling. The proof is in the armory, Inspector. A bag with a black lining, a crate with green paint, a tool with traces of wax. Sir Cedric took the sword, using his access and his replica as a decoy. Mr. Trent was to deliver it to Carver's buyer, but the plan was rushed. The drag marks, the alcove, they betray haste. Harrow's eyes widened, and he signaled his constable. Search the armory, now. Cedric's bravado crumbled, his voice shaking. I needed the money. The reenactments barely pay. I took the sword, hid it in my prop crate. Trent was to handle the sale. I didn't know the buyer. Trent, cornered, stammered. He approached me weeks ago. I knew Carver, but I didn't steal it. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. A simple plan, but human nature is never simple. Greed and pride, Mr. Trent. Sir Cedric, they undo us all. As Harrow's constable returned with the crate, its green paint and black-lined bag confirming her words, the hall erupted in murmurs. The Haverford sword, wrapped in cloth, was found within, its emerald glinting in the torchlight. Miss Marple settled back on her bench, her knitting resuming its rhythm. The truth, as always, had been in the small things, and she had merely followed their lead. Chapter 11. The truth unfolds. The great hall of Haverford Castle, its ancient stones steeped in the weight of centuries, seemed to exhale as the truth about the Haverford sword's theft emerged. The torchlight flickered, casting long shadows across the empty display case, now a silent witness to the drama's climax. Miss Jane Marple, standing near the center of the hall, her knitting bag still tucked under her arm, observed the scene with her characteristic calm, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. The suspects, Harold Grayson, Clara Wells, Sir Cedric Blake, and Lionel Trent, stood frozen, their faces a gallery of shock, guilt, and relief as Inspector Harrow's constable returned from the armory, cradling a wooden crate smeared with green paint. Within it, wrapped in coarse cloth, lay the Haverford sword, its emerald hilt glinting like a captive star. Inspector Harrow, his mustache bristling with a mix of triumph and exasperation, took charge at once. "Open it, lad," he barked, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The constable carefully unwrapped the cloth, revealing the sword in all its glory. Its blade unmarred, its hilt gleaming, the emerald catching the light as if it had never left its case. A collective gasp rose from the gathered crowd, and Lady Beatrice Conway, her lace handkerchief pressed to her lips, let out a sob of relief. "Jane, you've done it," she exclaimed, rushing to Miss Marple's side. "The sword! Oh, thank heavens!" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles appearing in her hands as if by magic, their soft clicking a counterpoint to the hall's tension. "Not I, Beatrice," she said gently. The truth was there, in the small things, the dust, the paint, the wax. I merely followed where they led. Harrow, holding the sword with gloved hands, turned to Sir Cedric, whose face had drained of color, his armor now seeming more a burden than a badge of honor. "You, Blake," Harrow growled. "You've got some explaining to do. Miss Marple's laid it out plain. Let's hear it from you." Cedric's shoulders slumped, his theatrical bravado crumbling like a poorly built set. He ran a hand through his beard, his voice low and broken. "It's true," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I took the sword. I needed the money. Reenactments don't pay for the life I've been living. The debts piled up and I saw a way out. The sword was my chance." Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her voice gentle but unyielding. "And you used your replica, didn't you, Sir Cedric? To delay discovery, perhaps, or to confuse anyone who looked too closely." Cedric nodded, his armor clinking faintly. "I made the replica myself, had it forged to match the Haverford sword, down to the weight and balance. I thought, if I could swap them, just for a day or two, no one would notice until it was sold. I used Grayson's tools to pick the lock, borrowed them from his office when he wasn't looking. I worked, by candlelight, to avoid the alarms, and hid the sword in my prop crate in the armory." Harrow's eyes narrowed. "And the drag marks, the alcove?" Cedric swallowed hard. "I moved the case slightly, to make it look like the theft happened later, after Grayson left. I hid the crate behind the armor in the alcove just for the night. I was going to move it out today, but you were all here too soon." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "And the green paint, Sir Cedric? From the crate, I presume?" He nodded, his face ashen. It's from my props. I painted the crate to match my reenactment gear. I didn't think anyone would notice." Harrow turned to Lionel Trent, who stood rigid, his hands still buried in his pockets, his eyes darting between Cedric and the sword. "And you, Trent," Harrow snapped. "You're in this up to your neck. Spill it." Trent's composure cracked, his voice trembling. "I didn't steal it, I swear. Cedric approached me weeks ago, knew I'd studied the sword, knew I had contacts in the antique trade. He said he could get it, and I knew a dealer, Carver, who'd pay a fortune. I was to arrange the sale, take a cut, that's all. I never touched the sword." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her voice calm but piercing. "You were tempted, Mr. Trent, by the promise of wealth. A quiet man, unnoticed, but with connections to a world where relics change hands in secret. Your questions about the lock, your frequent visits, they were preparation, weren't they?" Trent's shoulders sagged, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought, just a transaction, no harm done." Harrow snorted, signaling his constable. "Cuff them both. We'll sort out the charges, theft for Blake, conspiracy for Trent." He turned to Miss Marple, his tone grudging but respectful. "You've got a knack, Miss Marple. Those clues, paint, wax, a thread, I'd have missed them." She smiled, her needles moving steadily. "They're small things, Inspector, but they speak loudly if you listen. Like people, really, full of secrets, waiting to be understood." The hall stirred as the constable led Cedric and Trent away, Cedric's armor clanking mournfully, Trent's steps silent but heavy. Harold Grayson, his tic subsiding, clutched his notebook as if it were a lifeline, his face a mix of relief and exhaustion. Clara Wells, her scarf now retrieved and smoothed, approached Miss Marple, her eyes wide with gratitude. "You knew it wasn't me," she said softly. "Thank you." Miss Marple's expression was kind. "You're a good girl, Miss Wells, but even good girls notice things, don't they? You suspected Mr. Trent, I think, but kept silent." Clara's cheeks flushed. I wasn't sure. He was so quiet, but his questions about the lock, they made me uneasy. I should have said something." "No matter," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. "The truth has a way of coming out." Lady Conway, tears of relief in her eyes, clasped Miss Marple's hands. "Jane, you've saved the castle's honor. How can I ever thank you?" Miss Marple smiled, her gaze drifting to the sword, now being carefully examined by Harrow. "Keep it safe, Beatrice. And perhaps a stronger lock next time." As the hall began to clear, the sword returned to its case under Harrow's watchful eye. Miss Marple settled back on her bench. The truth had unfolded, as it always did, through the small things, dust, paint, wax, and human nature. The Haverford sword was back where it belonged, and Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet wisdom, felt the satisfaction of a puzzle well solved. Chapter 12. The castle, restored, the great hall of Haverford. Castle, its ancient stones now softened by the golden light of early evening, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The Haverford sword, its emerald hilt gleaming once more in its glass case, had been restored to its rightful place, the lock reinforced and the alarm system double-checked by Inspector Harrow's diligent constable. The hall, so recently, a stage for tension and suspicion, now hummed with a quiet gratitude, as if the castle itself were grateful for the return of its pride. Miss Jane Marple, seated on her familiar bench by the leaded window, her knitting needles clicking with their steady rhythm, observed the scene with a serene satisfaction. The puzzle was solved, the truth laid bare, and the castle's harmony, however briefly disrupted, was mending. Lady Beatrice Conway, her face no longer etched with worry, approached Miss Marple, her lace handkerchief now neatly folded in her hand. "Jane," she said, her voice warm with emotion, "you've saved us. The sword, the castle's honor, everything. I don't know how you do it, but I'm eternally grateful." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, her smile gentle. "It's no great secret, Beatrice. People are much the same, whether in a village like St. Mary Mead or a grand castle like this. They have their hopes, their fears, their little weaknesses. The Haverford sword was taken because of greed and pride, but it was the small things, the dust, the paint, the wax, that told the tale." Lady Conway sat beside her, her gaze drifting to the sword's case. "I still can't believe it was Sir Cedric. All that bluster, those grand speeches about honor, and he was planning to sell our treasure to some shadowy dealer." Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving steadily. Sir Cedric's passion was real, in its way, but it was for the role he played, not the relic itself. A man who lives for applause can be tempted by wealth, especially when debts press hard. And Mr. Trent, quiet, unassuming, saw a chance to profit without getting his hands dirty. It's a pattern I've seen before, Beatrice, in simpler places than this. Across the hall, Harold Grayson stood near the display case, his notebook tucked away, his tic noticeably subdued. He was speaking quietly with Clara Wells, whose cheerful demeanor was slowly returning, her scarf now neatly draped over her shoulders. The two seemed to share a moment of relief, their roles in the castle reaffirmed by the sword's return. Miss Marple watched them, her mind noting the small gestures, a nod from Grayson, a shy smile from Clara, that spoke of trust restored. Inspector Harrow, his mustache less bristling now, approached Miss Marple, his notebook tucked under his arm. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone a mix of respect and bemusement. "I'll admit, I thought you were chasing shadows with all that talk of threads and paint, but you were spot on. Blake's confessed everything, how he picked the lock, hid the sword in his crate, planned to pass it to Trent for that dealer, Carver. We've got the London police tracking Carver now." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "You're very kind, Inspector, but it was only a matter of listening to what the castle told us. The drag marks, the green paint, the wax, they were like a conversation, if one paid attention." Harrow chuckled, shaking his head. "You've a way with conversations, I'll give you that. If you ever tire of knitting, the yard could use you." Miss Marple's smile widened, but she said nothing, her thoughts already drifting to the train that would take her back to St. Mary Mead. The castle was quiet now, its staff returning to their duties, the visitors trickling back with whispered tales of the theft and its resolution. The Haverford sword, safe in its case, gleamed as if untouched by the drama, its emerald catching the evening light like a promise kept. Lady Conway rose, her energy renewed. "Jane, you must stay another day. Let us celebrate properly, a dinner perhaps in the banquet hall." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "You're too kind, Beatrice, but my garden in St. Mary Mead is calling, and I've a train to catch tomorrow. Besides, the castle has its sword back, and you've a fine staff to keep it safe. Miss Wells, in particular, has a good heart. She'll take extra care now, I think." Lady Conway sighed, but her smile was warm. "You're right, as always. Clara's shaken, but she's loyal. And Harold, he's already planning new security measures. We'll not let this happen again." As the evening deepened, Miss Marple gathered her things, her knitting neatly tucked into her bag. She took one last look at the great hall, its tapestries and stones now at peace. The sword's absence had revealed the frailties of those around it, Cedric's pride, Trent's greed, even Grayson's and Clara's hesitations. But it had also shown their strengths, their loyalty to the castle's legacy. Miss Marple thought of her village, where every face hid a story, and every story held a truth. Haverford Castle was no different, and she had merely read its pages. As she stepped into the courtyard, the cool evening air carrying the scent of roses, Miss Marple felt a familiar stir of curiosity. The train to St. Mary Mead awaited, but so did the next puzzle, the next tangle of human nature. With a final glance at the castle's towers, she smiled to herself, her needles already itching to resume their rhythm. The Haverford sword was home, and Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet wisdom, was ready for whatever mystery might next cross her path.